I have been shot at, shelled, and once used my own body weight as a fulcrum against a wound that would not close, both palms locked at a fixed angle for 11 straight minutes over a stretch of dark Afghan highway. None of it prepared me for the sound of a court reporter's keys. I sat in a molded plastic chair that had been designed by someone who had never actually sat in it, in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, and I did not move. My hands were folded on the table in front of me, fingers laced, the same posture I use when I brief an incoming trauma team. Calm hands, because panicked hands make other people panic. Under my right palm, flat against the laminate, sat a sealed envelope. I had carried it in my flight bag for 6 weeks. I had rehearsed in my head a dozen versions of the moment I might need to open it. I did not think that moment would be today. But I am a nurse who has done triage in the dark more than once, and you learn very quickly to stop being surprised by timing. The wound doesn't wait for you to be ready.
It simply arrives.
Across the room, my younger brother Preston sat with his hands folded the same way mine were, except his looked staged, like a man posing for a photograph he intended to frame later. He didn't look at me. He looked at the judge instead, the posture of a man still convinced he was going to win over an audience. "Miss Calloway," the judge said, Judge Alina Marsh, mid-50s, reading glasses pushed up into steel gray hair, a woman who had clearly heard every possible version of every family lie 100 times before breakfast. "Your brother has filed for emergency temporary guardianship over your medical and financial affairs. He's alleging a documented pattern of incapacity. Before I rule on the emergency order, I want to hear from both sides." I felt, more than saw, the collar of my blouse shift slightly against my collarbone. Underneath the fabric, resting against my skin on a thin ball chain, was a scrap of worn aluminum I had stamped myself, years ago, with 2 letters, E.V. Nobody in that room knew whose initials those were. Nobody in that room had ever thought to ask.
I said one sentence, and it was the only sentence I planned to offer for the next 40 minutes.
"I understand, Your Honor. I've been expecting this." Something moved in Preston's jaw. Small, almost nothing. The kind of flinch you'd miss unless you'd spent 16 years reading faces for the exact moment a patient's condition changes, before the monitor confirms it. He hadn't expected that answer. He'd expected fear. "I want to tell you how we got here. It started 16 years and 1 failed extraction ago, in a place my family has never had to think about, doing a job they've never bothered to understand. I am a flight nurse, Army Nurse Corps. 16 years in, most of them spent strapped into the back of a Black Hawk that had been gutted and rebuilt into a flying trauma bay, doing chest compressions at altitude, while the crew chief called out obstacles the pilot couldn't see. My call sign, on the record, is Dust Off 7 Alpha. In the real world, most days, I answer to Major Calloway. Lately, at home, I answer to nothing at all, because my family stopped using my rank around the same time they stopped asking what I actually do for a living, and started asking instead whether I was doing okay. 6 weeks before I ever sat in that hearing room, the phone rang at 21:40 hours, which is late enough that I already knew who it was before I looked at the screen. My mother doesn't call late unless something in the family needs managing, and lately the thing that needed managing was usually me. "Reese, honey, Preston wants to have everyone up to the lake house this month. Talk about the renovation. He says it's time we make some decisions." I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad in front of me, an old habit, a situation report format I use even for grocery lists, and felt the ache settle into the base of my skull the way it does right before the weather turns. Chronic nerve pain, service-connected, the souvenir of a hard landing during a night extraction outside Kandahar airfield that I do not discuss at family dinners, because there is no version of that story that fits between the salad course and dessert. I take exactly what the VA prescribes, on exactly the schedule the VA prescribes it, refilled at the same pharmacy, logged in the same chart, reviewed at the same quarterly appointment. I learned a long time ago that a woman who comes home from war with an invisible injury needs better documentation than a woman who comes home with a visible one, because nobody questions a cast. Everybody questions a prescription bottle they can't see the reason for. Decisions about what, Mom? About the house, I guess. About everything, really. Preston's worried about you. There it was. Not worried for me, worried about me. The specific flavor of concern people use right before they start managing your affairs instead of asking about your day. I didn't argue with her. I have learned, the hard way, that arguing with my family is a little like performing chest compressions on a patient who isn't actually in cardiac arrest. You can execute every step with perfect technique and still cause real damage, because the problem was never the one you were trained to treat. I hung up and sat a long while with the quiet apartment around me, the hum of the refrigerator, the particular silence of a place nobody visits. Then I opened a drawer I keep for exactly one purpose and pulled out a folder I had labeled in my own flat handwriting, Protocol. I didn't know that night precisely what Preston was planning, but I knew my brother, the shape of a man who had spent 2 years quietly drowning and had decided, somewhere in that private panic, that the water level was everyone else's fault but his own. Preston's cosmetic surgery practice had been hemorrhaging money since his second malpractice settlement, the one the family never discussed above a whisper. I didn't have proof of a specific scheme yet. I had a feeling, and after 16 years of triage instinct, a feeling is its own category of intelligence, the kind that tells you a bulkhead is failing not because you can see the crack, but because you recognize the sound the metal makes right before it gives. So I did the only thing that ever makes sense to a woman trained never to wait for the emergency to define the response. I got ahead of it, quietly, before anyone else in the family had decided there was a threat worth naming. I should tell you about the promotion ceremony first, though, because it explains more about this family than anything Preston ever put in a folder. 2 years ago, I pinned on Major in a gymnasium on post. My commanding officer reading the citation, a dozen fellow flight medics standing at attention in their dress uniforms, because that's what you do for each other, even when nobody else shows up. Nobody else showed up. My mother had a scheduling conflict. Preston had a consultation he absolutely couldn't move. I stood there in my Class A's afterward, alone in a parking lot, and felt the same hollow drop I'd felt 8 months earlier, standing over a 19-year-old private named Castillo, watching a monitor flatline, despite everything 2 hands and a working knowledge of trauma medicine could do about it, somewhere over a stretch of road that doesn't have a name on any map my family would recognize. I didn't save Castillo. I have made my peace with that, the only way anyone in this job ever really does, by understanding that some wounds are simply beyond the reach of even the best hands, and that the job is to try anyway, every time, without exception, because the alternative is a version of yourself you can't live inside. There was someone else on that same road that same night, a soldier young enough that I never learned much more about him than his blood type and the initials stitched into the collar of his gear, EV, before the handoff pulled him out of my hands and into the next echelon of care, the way it's supposed to. I never found out if he made it. That's the part civilians never understand about this job. You can hold someone's life together with your own 2 hands for 11 straight minutes, and then never learn how the story ends, because the war doesn't pause long enough to tell you. I stamped those 2 letters into a spare tag that night, on the flight line, half out of superstition and half out of something I didn't have a better word for at the time, and I've worn it under my collar every day since. A small, private vigil for a stranger I could never confirm was alive or dead. But here's the part I've never said out loud to anyone except Naomi, and I'm only saying it now because it matters for what comes later. I came home from that deployment carrying a debt I couldn't repay to a dead 19-year-old. And somewhere in my own head, without ever fully deciding to, I started trying to repay it sideways, onto my living brother instead. Every time Preston needed help I couldn't quite justify giving him, some quiet, unexamined part of me thought, at least I can save this one. At least this debt I can actually pay down. That instinct is the flaw in me that let Preston get as close as he did. Not weakness, not naivete, a very specific kind of guilt that had been looking for 2 years for somewhere to spend itself. I didn't know any of that yet, sitting in that plastic chair 6 weeks later. All I knew that first week was a folder labeled Protocol and a feeling I couldn't yet prove. So I started where I always start when I can't prove anything yet, with paperwork. The following week, I drove to the regional VA office to make the first move official. The woman behind the intake counter had kind eyes and a laminated badge that read Intake Specialist, and she read my request form twice before she finally looked up at me over her glasses. "You're filing this on yourself, Major?" "That's correct." "Most folks wait until somebody else questions their competency. You're requesting an independent medical evaluation preemptively, on your own initiative, with no complaint on file against you." "I'd rather set the terms of the exam than answer to someone else's version of it." She didn't fully understand, and I didn't explain it to her, because there are things you don't explain to people who have never had to construct a case file around their own body before somebody else builds one against it. What I understood, sitting under those fluorescent lights, filling out paperwork in triplicate, was simple. If my brother intended to weaponize my medical history, I intended to make absolutely certain there existed an independent, court-recognized, date-stamped, third-party record of my actual capacity, filed, witnessed, and time-stamped before he ever opened his mouth in front of a judge. Better my hand on the scalpel than his. I completed the request for a formal independent medical evaluation, an IME in the flat language of federal forms, fully aware it would take weeks to schedule, fully aware that the appointment itself, whenever it landed, would become the single most important date on a calendar nobody else in my family was tracking yet. I made a copy of the intake receipt. I sealed it inside an envelope. I placed the envelope inside my flight bag, next to my logbook and my spare set of dog tags. And I went back to work, because 16 years teaches you that the best possible defense against a threat you can't yet prove is to keep doing your job well enough that no one can credibly say you're failing at it. 2 weeks later, the whole family gathered at the lake house for what Preston called a planning session. The lake caught the afternoon light, the color of hammered brass, and the porch smelt like cedar and my mother's percolating coffee. And none of it matched the conversation happening around the folding table Preston had set up like he was chairing a board meeting, laminated renovation quotes fanned out in front of him with color-coded tabs. "We need somebody managing the timeline day to day," Preston said, not quite looking at me, addressing the quotes instead. "I've got the contractor relationships. I've got the bandwidth. Reese, you're..." He paused, the practiced pause of a man who wants a comment to sound spontaneous. "You're in and out so much with deployments and rotations, it's hard to plan a renovation schedule around a calendar that changes every month." "Send me the invoices anyway," I said. "I'll review them on my own time." "Sure, if you're up for it." I let that phrase sit in the air a beat longer than comfortable. I noticed it the same way I notice vitals trending on an unstable patient. Small, soft comments, delivered gently enough to sound like concern, but laid down with the precision of a man setting foundation stones for something much larger. In and out so much, if you're up for it. None of it on its own was an accusation. All of it, stacked together, was scaffolding. My mother refilled drinks and smiled the strained smile of a woman trying to keep a room warm that had started, almost imperceptibly, to cool. Preston's wife, Danielle, sat a little apart from the table, scrolling through her phone, the posture of someone who had learned long ago not to referee her husband's family disputes. Across the yard, down on the dock, my niece Mia sat cross-legged with a young man I didn't recognize, a nursing textbook open between them, the specific rhythm of one person explaining and one person nodding gratefully. "That's Eli," Mia called over, waving me down. "From my program. He's helping me survive cardiac farm before the final." The young man lifted a hand in a polite, brief wave and turned back to the textbook. Unremarkable. Pleasant. Background. I had no particular reason, standing on that porch with a glass of lemonade sweating in my hand, to notice the thin ball chain tucked under the collar of his t-shirt, the same posture of quiet concealment I wore under my own collar, 20 feet away, without either of us having the faintest idea we were carrying the same kind of object. Danielle joined me at the porch rail for a moment, watching the two of us, me on the porch, Preston at his laminated quotes, Mia and her quiet study partner down on the dock. "He's under more pressure than he lets on," she said, careful not to quite look at me. "The practice, I mean." It was the closest she ever came in all of this to warning me. I thanked her for the honesty and said nothing else, because I had already begun building a folder of my own, and some warnings you simply file away rather than answer out loud. I would think about that later, how two people can carry an identical weight in an identical hiding place and stand close enough to shake hands and never once know it. That same week, I drove onto post and found Naomi in her office. Captain Naomi Cross ran a JAG legal assistance office the size of a supply closet, with the direct, no-wasted words manner of someone who has spent a career translating dense military and legal bureaucracy into plain sentences for exhausted, frightened soldiers. We'd known each other 12 years, since a deployment where she'd sat with half my unit at 3 a.m, helping them write wills before a mission none of us discussed out loud. Legal assistance covers this, she said, flipping through my IME intake paperwork with practice speed. Personal civil matter, active duty status, no conflict of interest on our end. I can advise you fully. I can't represent you in a state probate proceeding if it gets that far. You'll need a civilian attorney once there's an actual filing. But right now, before anything's filed, let's talk about what your brother appears to be building. I told her everything. The soft comments at the lake house, the invoices he hadn't sent, the particular, deniable erosion of small remarks designed to be repeated later, stripped of context, in front of someone who hadn't been in the room to hear the tone. Naomi leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, eyes narrowed in the specific way she gets when a case starts resolving itself into a shape she recognizes. Here's the thing about guardianship fraud, Reese. It almost never announces itself with a bang. It's built in inches, in paperwork nobody bothers reading closely, filed by someone counting on the target being too exhausted, too proud, or too far away on a rotation to check the actual dates against reality. So I check the dates. You check everything, quietly, now. Because if he files first and you're reacting, you're playing defense in a public hearing, with your entire medical history read into the record by a man you used to trust at Thanksgiving. She tapped the folder. You've already filed the IME. That was the right instinct. Probably the single most important thing you've done in this whole situation. Guard that appointment like it's a mission timeline. Whatever else happens between now and then, that exam has to occur exactly on its scheduled date, in the right location, with the right people able to confirm where you actually were. And if someone tries to claim a competency finding for a day I can prove I was somewhere else entirely, then you haven't built a defense, Reese. You've built a trap, and he's the one who's going to walk into it. I left her office that afternoon with a legal pad full of dates circled in blue ink and a low, cold, entirely familiar certainty settling into my chest, the exact feeling I get in the seconds before a routine mission brief quietly turns into a real one. Before I go further, I need to answer a question Naomi asked me in that same meeting, honestly, because it's the reason Preston's petition had any traction at all beyond a plastic surgeon's wounded ego. Does he have any actual access to your accounts? Any legitimate paper trail that ties your finances to his? He did. 2 years earlier, when Preston's practice was failing its first real financial stress test, and Danielle was quietly asking me in private whether I could help before things got worse, I had co-signed a business expansion loan for him, $40,000, my name on the paper alongside his, my credit and my signature treated as collateral for a man I loved, and could not, at the time, watch drown without reaching for him. It had felt at the time like the smallest possible thing I could do. And it felt like something Castillo would have wanted somebody to do for his own sister, if he'd had one, if anyone had been in a position to reach. Naomi didn't lecture me. She simply wrote the figure down on her legal pad and underlined it twice. That's your exposure, she said. That's the paper he's going to point to and call financial entanglement consistent with dependency. It's not damning on its own, but it's a threat, and he's going to pull it. So we need to already know exactly what's on the other end of it before he does. I sat with that for a long moment. I had spent 2 years covering small gaps in that loan's repayment schedule whenever Preston fell behind, telling myself it was generosity, never once asking myself honestly whether it was actually something closer to guilt looking for a place to discharge itself. Naomi's silence, more than any lecture she could have given me, was the first moment I let myself see the shape of my own mistake clearly. "I'm done covering for him," I said, mostly to myself. "Whatever happens with the hearing, that ends regardless." "Good," Naomi said. "Fix the mistake you can actually fix. I'll handle the one he's trying to make for you." 3 weeks later, my mother hosted Sunday dinner, and Preston finally showed his hand. My mother's dining room smells the way it always has. Roasted chicken, rosemary, the particular warmth of a house that has hosted 40 years of Sunday dinners and absorbed every argument that ever happened at that table into its walls, without ever repeating one back. Preston waited until dessert. He set a manila folder down on the white tablecloth next to the gravy boat, with the exact rehearsed gentleness of a man who has practiced the gesture in a mirror more than once. "I didn't want to do this here," he said, which is precisely what people say directly before doing the thing they had absolutely intended to do there all along. "But I'm out of options. Mom, Reese, I had a physician review some records. There's a documented pattern of concern. Medication issues, cognitive fog. I think Reese needs support before something happens we can't undo." My mother's fork stopped, suspended, halfway to her mouth. I looked at the folder. I did not reach for it. "That's not my chart, Preston."
It's a professional clinical evaluation.
"From a doctor I have never once met. Dr. Voss reviewed your pharmacy records and your VA treatment history, and that I never authorized him to access." The table had gone entirely still. Danielle set down her wine glass without a sound, watching her husband with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not quite surprise, not quite support. My mother's eyes moved rapidly between the two of us, and I recognized on her face the exact look I have watched settle over family members in a hospital hallway. The specific terror of realizing you don't have anywhere near enough information to make the decision you're being asked to make immediately, in front of everyone. "Preston wants me to sign something," she said, almost to herself. "A temporary guardianship consent. Just until things are clearer," he says. "Sign nothing tonight, Nan. Reese, if there's even a small chance you need help, then let a real independent process determine that properly, not at a dinner table, not from a folder assembled without me anywhere in the room to respond." Preston's voice sharpened, the first visible crack in an otherwise composed performance. "You're always so calm about everything, aren't you? Even about this." His voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word, before he caught it and smoothed it back into the practiced calm of a man used to delivering bad news to people lying on operating tables. I looked at him for a long moment, the whole length of the table between us. I thought about 11 minutes of applied pressure on a wound that would not stop, on a dark stretch of road, and how the only thing that had kept that young soldier breathing was a nurse whose hands did not shake, no matter what her own heart was doing underneath. "Calm is the job, Preston." I stood, thanked my mother for dinner in a voice that did not waver, and left the folder exactly where it sat on the tablecloth, untouched, next to the gravy boat, like something radioactive nobody else at the table wanted to admit they'd noticed. Later that night, two separate threads finally converged. Mia found the draft petition entirely by accident, the way most family secrets get found, not through detective work, but through a 20-year-old looking for a stapler in her father's home office and noticing a document titled Petition for Emergency Temporary Guardianship sitting under a paperweight on his desk. She didn't understand every clause. She understood more than enough. She photographed the header and the date stamp and sent it to me with a single trembling line. "Aunt Ice, is this normal?" The date on that draft petition was 3 days before Preston had claimed at the dinner table that Dr. Voss had reviewed my records for the very first time. I forwarded the photograph to Naomi at 2300 hours. She called me back 11 minutes later. No greeting, straight into it. "I pulled what I could through proper channels," she said. "There's a scheduling correspondence trail. I'm not going to tell you exactly how it was confirmed because it matters that we obtain the rest of it the right way when the time comes, between your brother and a Dr. Grant Voss. The email arranging your quote-unquote clinical evaluation predates the date Voss lists as the actual exam by 17 days. He scheduled the diagnosis before the exam. That's precisely what it looks like on paper. Reese, this isn't sloppiness. This is architecture, which means we respond to it like architecture, methodically and on our own timeline, not his. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone pressed to my ear, looking at the second dog tag on my nightstand, the one I don't wear on duty because regulation doesn't permit personal jewelry against the flight suit. And I thought about how strange it was that the most dangerous person in my current life had never once faced incoming fire. And yet here I was, running a full evidence ladder in my pajamas at 11 at night because a plastic surgeon needed to save a house he couldn't otherwise afford to keep. When's my IME scheduled? 9 days. Then we hold the line for 9 days, and we do not blink first. 4 days into that count, I was standing over a patient bed, calling out vitals to a resident who was moving a half second too slow for my liking, when the process server found me. He was polite about it, which somehow made the whole thing worse. A man in a gray suit holding a sealed court document, waiting patiently for a break in active patient care, the way he might wait his turn at a coffee counter, while a cardiac monitor beeped steadily behind me, and 2 nurses at the station pretended badly not to be watching.
Major Calloway, I have an emergency ex parte order for you to accept.
The unit went quiet in that specific way a hospital floor goes quiet when everyone present suddenly urgently needs something to do with their hands. The resident I'd been supervising a moment earlier suddenly found something critical to check on the monitor. The charge nurse, a woman named Patricia, who had trained under me for 2 years, took 1 step toward me and then stopped herself, unsure whether comfort or professionalism was the correct response to a colleague being served court papers mid-shift.
I signed the acknowledgement. I read the order standing in the hallway, my uniform still smelling faintly of antiseptic and someone else's fear, while colleagues I had worked beside for 6 years watched a stranger hand me a legal document that used the word incapacitated in the same sentence as my own name and rank.
48 hours. That was the window the emergency order granted Preston. 48 hours of temporary authority over my medical decisions and financial accounts before a full hearing could even be scheduled. Granted entirely on the strength of Dr. Voss's written report and Preston's sworn declaration that I posed an immediate risk to my own safety. I folded the paper once, along its existing crease, and slid it into my bag beside the envelope I had already been carrying for 6 weeks. I did not call my brother. I did not raise my voice at the process server, at the charge nurse, at anyone.
48 hours. Understood.
I finished my shift to the end of the scheduled hour because a patient assignment doesn't stop existing just because your own life has started falling apart in the hallway outside the room. Only when the last handoff was complete did I walk out to the parking garage and call Naomi, 4 words loaded and waiting in my chest since the moment Preston had first set that folder down beside the gravy boat. It's time to move. Naomi moved fast. Within hours of the ex-parte order landing, she had filed an emergency motion asking Judge Marsh to accept my already pending VA independent evaluation, expedited, as the court's own capacity assessment ahead of the hearing, rather than ordering a second redundant exam on a compressed timeline that would only delay everything further. It wasn't the plan we'd built 6 weeks earlier. It was faster than that plan, and now it had to be. The judge agreed, the VA agreed to expedite, and the examiner assigned to complete it, as it happened, was the same physician my original request had already been routed to weeks earlier, a semi-retired evaluator named Dr. Marcus Whitfield. 36 hours before the hearing, I sat across from him in a small VA examination room and found out exactly what kind of doctor he was. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, with reading glasses on a cord, and the particular unhurried stillness of a man who had once done triage of his own, decades ago, in a place far hotter than this examination room, though he never once said so out loud. He didn't rush the exam, despite the compressed timeline, which I respected immediately. Cognitive screening, a thorough medication reconciliation against my actual VA pharmacy records, a long, careful conversation about pain management, sleep, mood, nothing performative, nothing designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. "You remind me of some medics I used to work beside," he said at one point, not looking up from his clipboard. "A long time ago, for me. I didn't think much of it at the time." "You filed this request on yourself 6 weeks ago," he said, glancing up from my chart, "before anyone else raised a concern. That's unusual. I like to control my own timeline." Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not quite recognition. Not yet. Just the small flicker of a man who has met a certain kind of patient before and respects the type without being able to place the specific face. He asked about my deployment history in the flat, procedural way intake always does. Checked boxes, noted dates, moved on to the next section of his form without lingering. If there was a version of this conversation where he could have connected a call sign and a chart to a night he remembered from 30 years of service, it didn't happen in that small examination room. It happened later, under oath, with the full record open in front of him, and no reason left to read it quickly. He shook my hand at the end of the appointment, brief and professional. "I'll have my findings to the court before your hearing, Major. For what it's worth, take care of yourself. Whatever's happening at home, your file speaks for itself." I didn't know, walking out of that clinic, exactly how completely those words would turn out to be true. That night, my mother's living room clock kept the same slightly imperfect rhythm it had kept for 30 years, a half-second lag on every tick that you stopped noticing after the first decade. And I have never heard it as loudly as I did sitting across from her in the near dark, only hours before the hearing, with just the porch light bleeding faintly through the curtains. "He says you'll thank him eventually," she said. "That this is protection. That's the word he keeps using. Protection."
Do you believe that, Mom?
She didn't answer right away, and I let the silence stretch, because some silences are actually somebody doing the hardest arithmetic of their entire life in real time. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Reese. I know my son is drowning in something he refuses to name out loud and has been for 2 years, and I've watched it and said nothing because I didn't know how to help him without humiliating him. And I know my daughter has never once in 16 years of service asked this family for a single thing." Her voice cracked just slightly on the last words. "I don't know how a mother chooses between the child who's loud about his pain and the child who's been silent about hers the entire time." "You don't have to choose a side tomorrow, Mom. You just have to walk into that room and watch what's actually true with your own eyes, instead of what either of us tells you. And if what's true tears this family apart completely, it's already torn, Mom. Tomorrow just decides whether we finally admit it out loud or keep pretending in a room full of people who already know." She reached across the space between us and took my hand, the first time in longer than I could easily remember that she had touched me with something other than obligation, and held it the way you hold an object you're genuinely afraid might not be there again tomorrow morning. "I'll be there," she said. "I don't need to win anything tomorrow. I just need to see it happen with my own eyes, once, without anyone managing what I'm allowed to know." I don't need to win either. I need to see. I let her keep that sentence, even though it had technically been mine first. Some nights, the kindest thing you can do for your own mother is quietly lend her your courage and let her carry it home as if it had always belonged to her. The next morning, we were back where I started this story. The same molded plastic chairs, the same burnt coffee smell, the same sealed envelope resting under my palm. 6 weeks of waiting, compressed into one flat rectangle of paper. Preston's attorney opened with the confident, almost relieved posture of a man who genuinely believes the hardest part of his case is already behind him. He introduced Dr. Voss's written evaluation into the official record, described a documented history of medication management concerns, cited the $40,000 co-signed loan as evidence of what he called an existing pattern of financial and psychological entanglement between the parties, and characterized what he termed a consistent pattern of behavior inconsistent with sound independent judgment. Legal language built to sound clinical while saying almost nothing that was actually verifiable at all. Dr. Voss himself sat 2 rows behind Preston in the gallery, a narrow, precise man in an expensive suit that had been chosen, I suspected, specifically for this appearance. He did not look at me once during the opening argument. He kept his eyes on a legal pad in his lap, writing nothing, the particular stillness of a man rehearsing an exit he hadn't yet needed to use. Judge Marsh listened without any visible reaction, the practiced stillness of someone who has heard confident opening arguments collapse in real time more often than she's heard them hold. Then she turned to the court-appointed independent examiner seated to her right, a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, reading glasses on a cord around his neck, with the unmistakable, unhurried stillness of someone who has spent decades in rooms where the wrong decision costs a life, not merely a house on a lake. Dr. Whitfield, you conducted an independent capacity assessment at the court's request. Please summarize your findings for the record. Dr. Marcus Whitfield opened his own folder and began reading, in the flat, procedural cadence of a man who has given sworn testimony many times before and long ago stopped needing to perform confidence because his findings didn't require performance. Medication compliance, he noted, fully verified through official VA pharmacy dispensing records, entirely consistent with prescribed protocol across an 18-month review window. Cognitive assessment, within normal limits across every measured domain, no impairment identified on any standardized instrument administered. Service record, reviewed briefly for clinical context regarding the origin and management of chronic pain. He stopped mid-sentence. I watched him read one particular line a second time. I watched his reading glasses come down off the bridge of his nose. Slowly, the deliberate way a man sets down a weapon he has only just realized was loaded the entire time he was holding it casually in one hand. Your Honor, I need to note something for the record. His voice had shifted registers entirely, no longer procedural, but quiet, almost private, the tone people use when the ground beneath an ordinary conversation has just, without warning, given way beneath their feet. This service record references a night extraction, a rescue operation, call sign Dustoff 7 Alpha, dated. He read the date aloud slowly, and somewhere behind me I heard a chair creak sharply as someone sat forward without meaning to. That call sign, Whitfield said, looking up now, directly at me for the first time all morning. Dustoff 7 Alpha, that's you. I know that call sign. I was the surgeon waiting at the aid station when that bird came in. The room did not yet understand what was happening. My mother's face showed pure confusion. Preston's face showed only irritation, the specific look of a man annoyed by what he assumed was a minor procedural interruption to a script he had already fully memorized and rehearsed to its conclusion. Then, from the back of the courtroom, where a quiet young man had been sitting through the entire hearing as Preston's own witness, brought in generically to describe how distant and overworked I'd seemed at recent family gatherings. A soft, deniable brushstroke his attorney had planned to use, without either Preston or Dr. Voss having the faintest idea who they were actually calling to the stand. A chair scraped back against the floor. Eli Vance stood up. His hand went to his own collar and pulled it open, and the thin ball chain I had noticed weeks earlier on a sunlit dock, tucked and entirely unremarkable at the time, came free into the flat fluorescent light of the hearing room. A dog tag, worn smooth and rounded at its edges from years of handling, dropped onto the wooden rail in front of him, with a small, hard, unmistakably metallic clack. A sound that had absolutely no business existing in a room built for custody disputes and inheritance disagreements. A sound that belonged to a different country entirely, a different kind of silence, a different kind of debt. That extraction, Eli said, and his voice was nothing like the flat procedural register everyone else in the room had been using all morning. It shook, openly, without any attempt to hide it. That's the night I should have died on that road. I know because I've read my own after-action report 100 times since. She's the reason I have a pulse right now. She's the reason I get to sit in a nursing classroom instead of a cemetery. Naomi rose from her seat at almost the exact same moment, sliding a stack of documents across the table toward the bench with the unhurried calm of someone who had been waiting 9 patient days to do precisely this. Your Honor, for the record, Dr. Voss's written evaluation is dated the 14th of last month. Major Calloway's official deployment and duty orders place her on an active flight rotation, off-station, on that exact date, independently corroborated by unit movement logs and 2 commanding officers currently available to testify by phone this morning if the court requires it. The evaluation as submitted describes an in-person clinical examination that could not physically have occurred as written.
Preston's attorney turned toward his own client, visibly recalculating. "Your Honor, if I may," Preston started, reaching for the same composed cadence that had carried him through 2 malpractice hearings. The words arrived a half-second too late to matter, and he let them die in his own throat. He did not turn toward anyone at all after that. He was staring at the dog tag lying on the wooden rail, as though it were an object that had simply fallen out of a clear sky into the middle of his carefully constructed hearing. Behind him, in the gallery, Dr. Voss had gone the color of the fluorescent light overhead. He did not stand. He did not speak. He simply closed his legal pad, very quietly, the way a man closes a door he already knows someone on the other side is about to break down anyway. And I understood, watching him, Preston had made the debt sound like somebody else's problem to solve. My own hand found the ball chain under my collar before I even decided to move it, the same 2 stamped letters I had carried unanswered for 2 years. E.V. I had never once let myself hope hard enough to imagine this exact moment. A courtroom, of all places, finally telling me the only thing I had ever actually needed to know. He had lived. He had lived and grown into a young man who studied cardiac pharmacology on a dock with my niece. And I had stood 20 feet away from that answer for weeks without recognizing it. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand. Inside my bag, I still carried the sealed envelope containing the original commendation packet for that extraction, a formal citation that, read aloud in that room, would have ended the entire argument permanently and humiliated my brother in front of every single person he had ever wanted to impress in his life. I had carried that envelope for 6 weeks, specifically as insurance, the kind of weapon you hope you never actually need to fire. I did not open it. Some victories don't require being read aloud for everyone to hear. Some victories are quieter than that, and they last considerably longer, because nobody can accuse you of having needed the applause. "Convoy's secure," I said. "That's all that matters." Judge Marsh did not take long to decide. She dismissed the emergency guardianship order in full, referred Dr. Grant Voss's conduct to the State Medical Board for formal investigation into fraudulent clinical evaluation and unauthorized access to protected federal health records, and noted for the record that the underlying petition itself would be forwarded to the District Attorney's Office for review under the state's guardianship fraud and forged medical record statutes, given the clear financial motive uncovered beneath it, a lake house and the mountain private debts it had been meant to erase. Preston did not look at our mother. He looked down at his own hands, the hands of a surgeon who had spent an entire career being trusted with other people's faces, now sitting perfectly still in a room where trust had just been formally, publicly, and permanently withdrawn from him.
"Reese," he said, finally, using my name instead of my rank or my file number, for the first time in 6 weeks.
"Not today, Preston." I kept my voice level, the same voice I used to tell a family that a surgery has been delayed, not canceled, just not today. Maybe not for a long time. Mia stood up from beside her mother. Danielle had gone pale and silent the moment the medical board referral was read aloud, some private calculation of her own clearly beginning behind her eyes, and walked directly past her father without slowing down. "You used my aunt's name and her medical file to try to steal a house," she said, not loudly, not performing for the room, just for him, quietly enough that only the people closest could hear it. Then she kept walking, straight toward me. My mother reached for Preston's hand out of 60 years of pure habit, an old reflex, older than either of us, and then, for the first time in his entire adult life, let it drop again, without ever finishing the gesture. She didn't say anything to him at all. She turned instead and crossed the room to where I was standing and put both arms around me, tightly, the way you hold someone when you're only now fully realizing how close you came to losing them through your own hesitation. "I should have believed you months ago," she said into my shoulder, her voice unsteady for the first time all morning.
You believed me the moment it actually mattered, Mom. That's the part that counts.
Naomi caught my eye across the emptying room and gave me the smallest possible nod, the specific economical gesture of two people who have run an operation together and watched it land exactly where it was supposed to. She didn't need to say anything either. 9 days of quiet groundwork had just been vindicated in under 4 hours, and neither of us had ever doubted it would be. Not really. Not once the dates lined up the way dates always eventually do when somebody bothers to check them.
Outside, the air tasted like rain that hadn't quite arrived yet, and after 4 hours in a room full of recycled air and fluorescent light, stepping onto the courthouse steps felt almost like stepping off a cargo ramp into somewhere real again.
Eli was waiting by the bottom of the steps, dog tag tucked back under his collar, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, looking like a young man who wasn't entirely sure he was allowed to say what he actually wanted to say.
"I've been trying to find you for almost 2 years," he admitted. "I didn't know how to start. Then Mia mentioned her aunt was a flight nurse, and I thought, it's a big army. It's probably not her. There's no way it's actually her. Then I saw you on that dock a few weeks ago, and He shook his head slowly. "I didn't want to make it about me. Not at your family's afternoon."
You didn't make it about you, Eli. You made it true, at exactly the moment it needed to be true.
He straightened, some old instinct taking over his posture without his permission, and offered a slow, formal salute, the kind you give an officer, entirely out of uniform, standing in front of a civilian courthouse, because certain forms of respect simply don't expire when the paperwork does. I returned it the proper way, clean and brief, and then did something regulation never actually taught me to do. I put my hand once, briefly, on his shoulder, the way you check that a wound has genuinely, finally, closed.
Go finish your degree, Corporal. Somebody out there is eventually going to need a nurse with your kind of memory. My mother was still standing by the courthouse doors, watching the two of us, her coat pulled tight against a wind that hadn't been in any forecast that morning. I walked back to her, and for the first time in longer than either of us could easily remember, neither one of us felt any need to say a single word. I flew again 3 weeks later. Same aircraft type, different crew, a training rotation, nothing like the night that started all of this. The bank account that used to carry Preston's name beside mine carries only mine now. One phone call, the Monday after the hearing, was all it took to close a debt that had never really been about money. It wasn't revenge. It was the last line on a ledger I owed myself. Castillo never asked me to spend the rest of my life settling accounts on his behalf, and I was the only one who could formally close it. Somewhere over open country, running through the pre-mission checklist out of pure habit, I felt for the ball chain under my collar without meaning to, the way you check a pulse on someone you already know is fine. The envelope with the citation inside it is still sealed. It's sitting in a fireproof box in my closet now, instead of my flight bag, because I no longer need to carry it into every room I enter. Some evidence you keep for the record. Some evidence you finally get to simply put down.